"What did you force the old man into the car for?" as Officer Hughes roared, yanked Malik by the collar, and slammed his head onto the cold hood. The black man barely managed to choke out a single trapped sound in his throat when a secret slipped from his pocket, a small paper with only one emergency number written on it. Hughes smirked. "Let me see who you think you can still call." But only a few seconds later, everything flipped. Malik strained for breath and whispered, "Call my sister." And just as Hughes was about to scoff, a woman's voice came through the phone. "Do not touch my brother a second time. Who is she?" Why did a single sentence drain the color from Hughes's face? When the truth surfaced, a Navy SEAL stepped into the picture, and the man abusing his authority suddenly had far more to fear. If you were Malik, would you rise up or stay silent under a tyrant's hand? Share your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to catch the next even more explosive chapter. That quiet afternoon in the residential neighborhood, Malik slowed his gray sedan when he noticed a figure leaning against a streetlight pole ahead. It was Mr. Doyle, his silver hair tousled in the breeze, his body swaying as if his legs no longer had the strength to hold him up. Malik braked, leaned over for a clearer look, and saw the old man's hands trembling hard, his face drained by a sudden wave of medication dizziness. He froze at the edge of the sidewalk, his vision blurring as he tried to find something to steady himself. Malik opened the door, hurried over, and caught the man's flailing arm just in time. He spoke in a warm but urgent tone. "Let me take you home. Standing like this is dangerous," and gently supported the man's heavy frame. Mr. Doyle tried to nod, his breath choked by exhaustion, his hand gripping Malik's arm like a final lifeline. Malik opened the rear door, one arm holding the man upright, the other supporting his head as he lowered himself into the seat. The back seat seemed to shrink beneath the frail body, but Malik adjusted him carefully, buckling the seatbelt so he would not fall over once the car moved. Mr. Doyle's eyes grew hazy, yet carried a flicker of gratitude, his lips moving with words that never formed. Malik scanned the street, figuring out the quickest route to take him home or to a clinic. He had not yet closed the door when the sharp screech of braking behind him cut through the calm of the afternoon like a blade. A patrol car stopped at the curb only a few meters away. Malik turned just as Officer Hughes's eyes, his face flushed and his stare sharpened with suspicion, locked onto the scene. Malik standing beside an open car door, and Mr. Doyle slumped weakly in the back seat, his head tilted forward. Hughes did not ask a single question, nor did he take a moment to look at anything more. The scene in front of him snapped into place like a script he had already prepared in his mind. He opened his door and stepped out, his shoe hitting the pavement hard, each dry, sharp thud carrying an accusation Malik could not trace the source of. Hughes's face tightened with every step he took. He looked at Malik with a suspicious stare as if he were looking at a criminal caught in the act. Malik instinctively raised a hand to explain, but the words jammed in his throat under the weight of that stare. Hughes kept scanning, his eyes moving from Malik's hand, still near the old man's shoulder, to the open rear door. Mr. Doyle turned his head slightly, but was still too dazed to form a full sentence. To Hughes, every one of those details became evidence that supported the suspicion he had already stitched together in a matter of seconds. He paused for a beat at the car door, his chest rising sharply with tense breaths. Malik could see the irritation in his eyes, the rush to judge that he could not understand. Malik drew a breath, trying to stay calm, and stepped lightly to the side so he would not make things worse. But Hughes advanced his expression, turning cold, his voice snapping out with a harshness that hit Malik like a slap. A simple moment of kindness twisted instantly under the mechanical and authoritarian gaze of someone holding power. Without waiting for any explanation, without giving the old man a chance to speak, Hughes assigned Malik the role he wanted to see, and that moment opened the chain of misunderstandings that would turn a seemingly ordinary afternoon into the start of a tragedy. Hughes had barely stepped out of his car when the screech of his sudden stop still hung in the air, a sharp jolt that made the entire neighborhood turn their head. He saw Malik standing near the open car door and Mr. Doyle slumped in the back seat looking drained, and in that instant, everything in Hughes's mind erupted like a fuse hitting flame. He shouted, "Let him go!" his voice cracking like a whip, startling the birds on the power line and making them scatter, while Mr. Doyle trembled, his hand gripping the edge of the seat in fear. Malik flinched at the sudden aggression and tried to step aside to explain, but Hughes lunged as if Malik were about to flee. "I am helping him," Malik said, as Hughes's hand slammed onto his shoulder, forcing him hard against the car, his face turned to the side from the impact. The cold metal against his skin made him shiver, but it was nothing compared to the shock and humiliation when he realized Hughes had decided he was the culprit on sight. "You think I do not know this trick?" Hughes growled, his breath hot with anger, against Malik's ear. "There was an elder extortion case in this area last week. They got caught pretending to be helpful exactly like this. He was not saying it to inquire. He was saying it to declare guilt to lock Malik into a script he had already written." Malik started to speak, but Hughes tightened his grip until Malik's shoulder burned. Malik turned, hoping Mr. Doyle could say something, but the old man was panicked from the shock. He shook his head weakly, his lips moving with broken fragments of words that formed no sentence, which only convinced Hughes further that he was frightened of Malik. Each passing second twisted the moment, turning an act of help into something darker and more threatening in Hughes's eyes. From nearby porches, residents began peeking out of windows, some stepping onto their stoops for a clearer view. They saw a tense scene, an officer pushing a black man hard against a car, while an old man looked distressed, too frail to stand. A few faces showed flickers of doubt, but confusion outweighed everything because no one fully understood what was happening. A woman behind a small gate whispered to her neighbor, "What is going on?" But their voices carried uncertainty, and no one dared approach because Hughes's intensity dominated the street. Malik noticed their presence, but did not expect help because all they could see was a distorted picture him standing beside a frail old man while an officer shoved him onto the hood. None of them hearing the first exchange, none of them seeing the moment he caught Mr. Doyle before he fell. A brief misunderstanding had already grown into a heavy shadow, settling into the minds of everyone watching. Hughes stepped back to take in the scene as if Malik were dangerous, his eyes sweeping across every detail, not to find innocence, but to confirm what he already believed, a buried bias waiting for its chance to surface. He said, "The case last week happened right near here, loud enough for the whole street to hear his voice full of confidence in his own judgment. They did the exact same thing." He looked at Malik as if he were replaying an old routine, and it tightened Malik's throat. Before Malik could explain anything else, Hughes yanked his arm higher, his tone final, as if everything had been decided from the first moment. Malik turned his head slightly and felt Mr. Doyle's strained breath behind him, and he understood clearly that nothing he said would matter now. The old man's weakness, the open car door, the angle of Malik's stance, all of it had already been shaped into the story Hughes wanted to believe. The space between them felt smaller, heavier, pushed tight by misunderstanding. More eyes gathered from the homes nearby, whispers rising from a distance, yet not a single person stepped forward to ask or intervene. The air thickened, weighed down by unconfirmed judgments. People stood, frozen in uncertainty, unsure of what they were witnessing, but too intimidated to come closer, too distant to see the truth. Malik stood in the center of a misunderstanding that kept swelling, feeling every stare settle on him through the distorted reflection of the car window. The warped glass showed a version of him that matched the one in Hughes's mind, a black man treated as a threat for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it had all started from one biased look, a single instant that flared up and swallowed every explanation before it could even be spoken. Hughes barely gave Malik a second to breathe. He grabbed Malik's arm and yanked him away from the car door, making him stumble into the edge of it before shoving him face down onto the hood. The cold metal pressed hard against his cheek and forehead, making his vision blur as Hughes's arm pinned him down. Malik's hands were twisted behind him, his shoulder pulled tight until even the smallest movement sent sharp pain through him. He tried to lift his face from the metal, but Hughes's hand came down heavier, forcing all his weight onto Malik and shaping him into the perfect image of the criminal Hughes had already decided he was. Under that crushing pressure, Malik managed to speak through a shaken breath. I am helping him, each word slipping out against the force pinning his chest. He needed Hughes to see the truth, needed his voice to break through the bias covering the man's eyes. But Hughes sliced through every hope with a shout as sharp as a blade. You think I am stupid? His tone dripping with anger and a twisted sense of satisfaction at what he thought he had caught. Malik heard him, heard his own heartbeat pounding in his ears against the hood, heard even his strained breath bouncing back from the surface pressed against his face. Every second felt like a sentence already handed down with no right to defend himself. Behind them, Mr. Doyle tried to turn in his seat, his trembling hand gripping the door as if he could send whatever strength he had left to the man helping him. He leaned toward Hughes and Malik, his eyes clouded by dizziness, yet fighting to form words. His voice was thin, like fading smoke. No, he is helping. But the last part was cut off by another wave of faintness, his body tilting as if he might collapse. Malik heard the frail sound, tried to turn his head, hoping Hughes would hear the truth in the old man's voice, but those fragile words vanished in the air, drowned by Hughes's anger and Malik's ragged breathing. To Hughes, the broken sentence was not proof of innocence, but a sign of fear. Instead of clearing anything, the misunderstanding dug even deeper. Hughes shot a quick glance at the old man, saw him swaying, his lips trembling with no clear words, and instantly took it as the reaction of someone being coerced. In his mind, the scattered pieces rearranged themselves into a distorted picture that matched exactly what he wanted to believe. A flicker of hesitation in Mr. Doyle's eyes became evidence. The weakness in his breathing became confirmation. Every exhausted movement turned into another sign that Malik was trying to hide a crime behind a story of helping. Hughes leaned close to Malik's ear, his voice rough and full of smug certainty. That is right. You are scared. He will tell the truth, aren't you? Driving the words into Malik's mind like tightening another chain around a situation he had no way to break. Malik felt the weight of helplessness tightening around him as if he were being dragged into a dark pit where every word he spoke only pulled him deeper. His lips pressed together in an effort to stay calm, though anger still surged in his chest. He turned his face toward Mr. Doyle, toward the man's hand hanging weakly over the seat, and in that moment he saw the real fear on the old man's face. It was not fear of him, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being unable to say the truth clearly. Malik wanted to speak for him, wanted to shout so the whole street would hear, but his voice thinned under Hughes's weight. Hughes saw every movement, yet not with eyes searching for truth. He looked with the confidence of someone convinced he had been right from the start. Anyone can see what this is, he said, with absolute certainty, as if everything had already been settled the moment he slammed on his brakes earlier. Suspicion had become the lens shaping his every action. To him, the more Malik tried to object, the guiltier he seemed, and the more Mr. Doyle trembled, the more Hughes took it as proof that he was under pressure. Everything was pulled into the narrow path of his bias, which he mistook for sharp professional instinct. A light breeze moved down the St. Ree, but did nothing to ease the tension, trapping the three people caught in a warped scene. More residents appeared in doorways, some stepping closer with hesitant eyes. They looked from a distance, watching Malik pinned hard against the car, watching Mr. Doyle look frail enough to slip from the seat, watching Hughes burn with anger like someone delivering a sentence without verifying a single detail. Everything happened too fast. The truth smothered before it had a chance to form, buried beneath the force that felt justified by prejudice and suspicion. Malik tightened his hands, his wrists throbbing as if the pressure were grinding into bone. He did not know how much worse things would get, but one truth was painfully clear. Hughes had decided his fate at first glance, and now Malik was paying for the certainty of a man who believed his suspicion was the law. The next part of this moment depended only on how far Hughes chose to push it, and Malik, pressed against the cool metal of the hood, understood that a simple act of kindness had been twisted into something unrecognizable, opening a tragedy he never imagined could unfold on a quiet afternoon like this. The tension between Hughes and Malik stretched as a rope pulled tighter at every knot, and just as Malik felt that any hope of changing the situation rested only on Mr. Doyle's weakening breath, another patrol car turned in from the corner. Two young officers stepped out at their movement, stiff with uncertainty as they tried to grasp what they were walking into while still keeping the strict posture required of them. One glanced at Malik pinned against the car, then at Mr. Doyle gasping in the back seat, his eyes flashing with surprise and unease as he realized this chaos did not match any scenario they had trained for. They moved closer, staying at a supportive but cautious distance. One of them narrowed his eyes at Hughes and lowered his voice so the crowd would not hear Hughes' the black driver case last year. "You got it wrong." The words made Malik shift his attention toward them, sensing something in the officer's tone that hinted at an untold truth. Hughes froze for a second, then clenched his jaw, his eyes sharpening with a defensive spark, as if the memory of that year still jabbed at him like a thorn. "That one ran," he said with irritation mixed with self-justification, then jabbed a finger toward Malik pinned to the hood. "This one targets an old man, same thing." The statement sounded like a verdict, repeated a mistake used to cover another mistake. Malik's heart sank for a moment as he understood Hughes was reliving an old failure and trying to compensate by winning this case at any cost. Malik did not know the details of what happened last year, but that small piece of information was enough for him to see that today's aggression did not come from anything he did, but from a fixation lodged deep in Hughes's mind. Malik felt like he was being forced into the role of someone else, someone Hughes once failed to catch or once misjudged, and that realization made Hughes's actions feel even more reckless. The other young officer looked at Hughes as if he wanted to speak, but swallowed his words, still bound by his lower rank. Yet the people standing nearby, the residents watching the scene unfold, had begun to notice the absurdity in Hughes's behavior. He was not listening to explanations, not asking a single question to verify anything, only twisting every detail into evidence supporting his bias. Hughes stepped forward, tilted his head, and said with complete certainty, "These types pretend to be kind and demand money after." His words came out softly but carried heavy weight, not as an argument but as a conclusion he had held long before this moment. Those words hung in the air like a final stamp against everything Malik tried to say, because for Hughes, prejudice was not a sudden reaction but a deeply rooted habit, guiding the way he judged anyone who stood in front of him. And in that moment, Malik understood he was not fighting an accusation but a mindset molded by a history he had nothing to do with a past that had already written the ending Hughes wanted to see. Malik tightened his hands locked behind his back, feeling his body pinned down not only by Hughes's weight but by the prejudice piling onto every inch of him. In that moment he understood Hughes had not come to investigate, not to look for answers. He had come only to confirm what he believed from the very first second he saw Malik helping Mr. Doyle into the car. Malik lowered his head, his breath hitting the hood in fast bursts, and it became clearer with each beat that Hughes was not searching for truth. He was searching for justification. Every detail at the scene was twisted in the most damning direction, every word distorted to fit Hughes's rigid certainty, and every reaction Malik made turned into proof supporting the wrong conclusion Hughes had already chosen. Hughes paused after that pronouncement, his eyes sweeping over Malik with a quiet sense of triumph, as if he had just placed a winning piece on the board. The crowd was no longer completely silent whispers, spreading more sharply as the misunderstanding became obvious to anyone still thinking clearly. A few uncertain looks shifted toward Hughes as people began comparing his aggression with Mr. Doyle's frailty and Malik's helpless panic, realizing the balance was tipping toward injustice. But Hughes did not care, lost in the warped confidence that he was the only one who understood what was happening. Malik exhaled hard, knowing that from this point on no explanation would matter to Hughes, and the thought made him feel as if he were being pushed to the edge of a cliff with no way out. A light breeze passed as if trying to calm the heavy air, but Hughes's prejudice stood firm, a barrier no logic could break. And Malik, trapped between force and assumption, understood that what awaited him would be far worse now that someone like Hughes had decided to twist an act of kindness into an accusation he would not let go of. The air around the gray sedan felt thicker as Hughes shifted his focus from Malik to Mr. Doyle. He stepped toward the rear door, bending down to eye level, as if he were conducting a proper investigation, but the way he approached made Mr. Doyle flinch, his shoulders trembling with the reflex of someone too exhausted to understand what was happening. Hughes narrowed his eyes, studying the pale face and broken breaths, then barked loud enough for several nearby residents to jolt. "You were forced into the car, right?" His voice hit like a verdict already written, the question designed not to find truth but to corner it into the answer he wanted. Mr. Doyle's eyes widened, but dizziness made them blur, tears forming at the corners from fear and from the crushing weight of Hughes's tone. He tried to speak, his mouth shaken as the dizziness refused to ease. "No, I got in my..." The words came out thin and scattered, each one slipping apart because his mind was spinning and his throat was dry. Those close enough could hear him trying to speak the truth, but they also saw his body, failing him too weak to repeat it with strength. Malik turned his head toward the old man, his eyes clinging to the hope in that broken sentence, even though he knew Mr. Doyle's fading strength would make his words almost meaningless to someone like Hughes. Malik wanted to call out to help him, but his arms were pinned too tightly, his breath sharp and trapped as if even defending himself had been taken from him. Hughes leaned closer, placing his ear near Mr. Doyle's mouth like someone trying to listen carefully, though he had no intention of accepting anything the old man was trying to say. As soon as Mr. Doyle reached the last part of "I got in my..." Hughes cut him off his hand, slicing the air as he declared triumphantly, "You were too weak to resist. He pulled you in." The words burst out as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if Mr. Doyle's frailty was the perfect piece to snap into the story Hughes had built the instant he saw Malik. Malik felt his body stiffen, the brief flicker of hope collapsing under that forced conclusion. Hughes straightened, pulling out his notebook with the confidence of someone who believed he already held the truth. He wrote quickly, each stroke of the pen pressing down like nails, sealing the door on reality. "Victim confirms he was coerced." He read aloud, each word sharp, as if it were the only statement made at the scene. Mr. Doyle raised a trembling hand, his lips moving in what looked like an attempt to protest, but another dizzy wave hit him, forcing him back into the seat, his rapid breath swallowing the rest of the sentence. Malik watched the old man fight his own failing body to defend himself, the helplessness swelling inside him like a weight crushing his chest. He wanted to shout that Hughes was twisting everything, wanted to shield Mr. Doyle from the cruelty of being misrepresented, but every objection escaped only as a choking breath pinned beneath Hughes's hand and the lie tightening around them both. People around them began to sense something was wrong. They heard the small fragment, "No, I got in my..." and saw how Hughes cut across it, twisting Mr. Doyle's words. A few exchanged worried looks, though none were brave enough to step forward forward against an officer exploding with anger. The scene hung suspended between two extremes, an elderly man dizzy and fighting to speak the truth, a black man pinned to a car with breath tightening in his chest, and a policeman reshaping everything he wanted through sheer force of voice. Malik could feel the truth being crushed under every stroke of Hughes's pen, the scratch of it scraping against his ribs. In that moment, the distortion in Hughes's conclusion was no longer a mistake or a lack of information. It was a choice, a deliberate one. He chose to use Mr. Doyle's frailty as a tool to reinforce a charge against Malik. What twisted in Malik's chest was the confidence in Hughes's eyes as he closed his notebook as if he had completed an excellent task without caring that he was destroying an innocent man's life. Malik lifted his face from the hood, his vision shadowed by Hughes, yet he forced himself to meet that expression. Not to resist, but to remember to mark that this was not a simple misunderstanding, but an act of intentional abuse of power. Hughes turned to his colleagues, his tone flat and authoritative. Victim is weak, statement is clear, suspect resists, as if everything had already been established, though the truth had never been fully heard. A gust of wind passed, brushing a few dry leaves across the front of the car, carrying with it a heavy sense of loss Malik could not name. What he saw in front of him was not someone protecting the community, but someone using authority to crush everything he had been trying to hold on to. Trust, kindness, and the fragile hope of an old man who had tried to speak for him. Caught between Mr. Doyle's fading breath and Hughes's cold notes, Malik realized a painful truth. The real version of events had been blocked, and he was being pushed deeper into the pit Hughes had molded from obsession, bias, and unchecked power. And in that moment he knew that tragedy was no longer a misunderstanding but a charge, written to match the will of the man standing over him, notebook in hand, already seeing him as guilty from the first second. Hughes snapped his notebook shut and turned toward the sedan with its rear door still open. His gaze swept over the empty space framed by the doorway where Mr. Doyle sat, struggling to breathe and stay upright. He pointed directly at that opening, his voice sharp and final. "This is a classic kidnapping setup." The words hit the pavement like a judge's ruling, leaving no room for anyone to react, just as he had turned every detail around him into pieces of a story he had already prepared. A nearby resident squinted clearly, unable to grasp how an open door could be treated as proof of such a serious crime, yet no one dared challenge Hughes while he stood there, radiating absolute conviction. Hughes shifted toward the two young officers as if passing his certainty to them so none would think he was acting out of emotion. "Suspect was preparing to extort," he said slowly and firmly, like he was reading from a pre-written professional report drawn from years of experience. The two officers glanced at each other, then at the scene, a flicker of confusion passing between them, but they still nodded out of habit. One tried to meet Hughes's eyes to see if he had any real evidence, but the force in Hughes's stare pushed the question back down into silence. Hughes stepped past them, positioning himself so the crowd could hear, as if collecting witnesses would strengthen the story he was constructing. He began laying it out smoothly. He put the victim in the car without a clear reason, then planned to drive away to pressure the family. Each word settled like ink fixing into place, turning a kind act into a crime, described with practiced ease. Malik lifted his face from the hood when he heard that the ache in his wrists and shoulders pulsing, but the sense of injustice pounding even harder. He turned as much as he could and spoke, his voice strained but clearer than before. "I did nothing wrong, I was helping him." The moment the words left him, Hughes shot a harsh glare in his direction and launched the familiar phrase used by those who crush every attempt at defense. "That is what every criminal says." Malik bit his lip, the sentence stripping him of the right to be seen as a human being. Every word he tried to offer was blocked by Hughes's accusing tone, twisting even the smallest resistance into fuel for deeper suspicion. A few nearby residents heard that exchange clearly. They began whispering among themselves, some wondering whether Hughes was speaking from truth or from anger, rising unchecked. They looked at Malik, saw him trying to turn toward Mr. Doyle, saw the honesty in his eyes, then looked at Hughes, saw the intensity that felt nothing like a calm investigation. Yet uniforms and authority kept them quiet. The silence hung heavy as if everyone sensed the distortion happening before them but lacked the courage to step in and confirm what was real. Hughes motioned for his partners to prepare a full report, his voice steady as if summarizing a scene for an internal briefing. The suspect exploited the victim's weakness, approached under the guise of helping, then placed him in the car without clear consent. He said words like someone presenting evidence, even though the facts existed only in the heat of his imagination. One young officer hesitated and asked, "Are you sure?" He looked like he was trying to say something. Hughes snapped his head toward him, his eyes flashing a warning that cut the question short. "Who are you trying to protect?" he asked softly, but with enough threat to silence any response. Mr. Doyle slowly raised his hand as if trying to hold on to the air to keep from fading. He wanted to speak, wanted to challenge what Hughes was writing, but his throat was too dry and his mind too dizzy, turning his words into broken gasps. Malik saw that trembling hand, saw the desperation in the old man's eyes, and felt the urge to tear through the distance between them and defend him. But he was pinned too tightly, his breath heavy, unable to break into the steady stream of accusations Hughes confidently dictated for the others to record. Hughes's pen moved across the page as if copying down the only truth he was willing to believe. The scratch of it echoed sharply in Malik's ears like the sound of someone engraving his fate according to their own will. The report painted Malik's actions as part of an organized crime attempt, complete with detailed descriptions despite the lack of any verified evidence. Each line Hughes added made Malik feel the helplessness deepen. He could already sense how this report would be used against him, knowing Hughes was crafting an entire script designed to make him a criminal without a single step of real investigation. When Hughes closed the notebook and said, "Report is completed, case will be sent up," Malik felt as if the last door to truth had slammed shut in front of him. The crowd looked at one another, some placing hands over their chests as the unease spread. They saw no proof of kidnapping beyond Hughes's words, yet his certainty left them unsure of what to believe. Malik pressed his forehead against the car, physical pain mixing with the weight of being trapped inside a story that had never belonged to him. In the chaos of abused authority, he felt himself sinking into the role Hughes had written for him to cover the man's own obsessions, pushed into a cruel script with no chance to break free. Hughes moved in, his eyes darkening as if he were looking at something that needed to be subdued immediately. He grabbed Malik's wrist and tightened his grip until the joints burned. Malik had no chance to brace himself before his body was yanked forward and locked in place with a harsh motion. The cold cuffs snapped onto his wrist, the metal clashing loudly and making his knees buckle on instinct. Pain shot from his wrist up to his shoulder, tightening along his spine as if every nerve were being twisted to match Hughes's will. Malik tried to hold himself up, but the force of that rough hand pressed him down until his knee hit the pavement, his whole body pushed toward the ground by an unspoken command from the man standing behind him. "I was helping him." Malik managed to say, his breath catching under the weight of Hughes's arm crushing down on his back, making it hard to inhale. His voice was not a plea for rescue, but a desperate attempt to let the truth be heard even once. But as soon as the words left him, Hughes shoved his head harder against the hood, the cold paint pressing into his cheek and forehead. His ears rang, his breath bounced back at him, tightening his chest. "Stop lying," Hughes growled above him, his breath hitting Malik like hot wind from a rage that was no longer under control. Malik tried to lift his head to show he was not resisting, but the hand on his neck was as heavy as stone, pinning him until the front of his body was flattened against the car. The imbalance of power was so stark that each second felt like being pushed closer to a pit with no visible bottom. A middle-aged man standing nearby could not contain his frustration and shouted, "He is helping him!" The call cut through the air, drawing the agreement of many who had gathered along the street. They saw Malik trying to explain only to be silenced, saw Mr. Doyle, weakly shaking his head, heard fragments of the old man's words enough to understand that Hughes had crossed a line. but despite their anger, none dared step forward. They all knew one truth: confronting an officer in a state like this was no different from placing themselves in danger. Their eyes followed Malik from a distance full of pity and withheld outrage, each person swallowing their sense of injustice out of fear that trouble would spill onto them. Malik felt that in every small movement of the crowd, in the helpless sighs rising around him and the loneliness squeezed around him like an invisible rope tightening at his throat. He understood he was not just being restrained, he was being cornered, cut off from any voice that could save him, pushed toward despair by a man who had already decided what story he wanted to believe. A breath slipped out of Malik, not from pain, but from the truth that he was trapped among people who clearly saw something wrong, yet did not dare speak another word. He saw his own reflection on the hood, distorted and dim under a layer of dust, just like the way his image had been distorted in Hughes's eyes. Malik felt himself losing ground, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was facing a man who could twist every word he said into evidence against him. The thought made a wave of helplessness rise so sharply that he clenched his fists even though the cuffs bit into his wrists. A bead of sweat fell onto the hood, sliding along the cold metal curve, and Malik understood that if he kept believing he could explain his way out, he would only sink deeper into the trap Hughes had built. Behind him, Mr. Doyle tried to reach out his trembling fingers, stretching toward Malik as if to say something, but another wave of dizziness dragged his hand back down. Malik saw it, and in the chaos of pain, fear, and rising despair, the clearest thing he felt was that the old man was utterly powerless to defend him even though he wanted to more than anyone else. A cold shiver ran down Malik's spine as he realized how completely isolated he was. An elderly man, too weak to speak, could not save him. The surrounding neighbors lacked the courage to step in, and in front of him stood an officer determined to lock him into a role he had chosen. In that moment, Malik closed his eyes to keep the sting in his temples from spreading. Then, from somewhere deep inside, a thought rose with such clarity that it felt like a familiar voice speaking directly to him. One person, and only one, could turn this situation around in the truest sense. Someone unafraid of authority, immune to bias, someone who had pulled him out of darker moments than this. His breath caught, his eyes opened with renewed resolve. He knew what he had to do. Malik pressed his lips together and tried to twist his body, even though Hughes's grip kept him pinned, but he needed enough space to speak. He drew in a breath, gathering every bit of strength left in his lungs, and said, in a low but firm tone, packed with enough determination to cut through the despair tightening around him, "Call my sister." The words broke through the suffocating wall around him, making a few residents glance at one another in surprise. Malik pushed harder and repeated it clearer, this time, "Call my sister." And for the first time since being forced onto the hood, Malik felt a trace of hope slip into the darkest moment of his life. Malik's wrists ached until they went numb. His breath cut short by Hughes's hand pressing against his neck, making it almost impossible to draw in a full breath. His forehead was pressed too, the cold hood sweat sliding along the curve of the metal and mixing with the tremble at his lips as he tried to hold on to what was left of his strength. Malik knew he was going to collapse if he did nothing, and in the moment when everything felt like it was dragging him under his eyes, caught a man standing nearby, hesitant, filled with sympathy. Malik gathered the last bit of air in his lungs, his voice breaking out weak and trembling like a bird's flutter at dusk. "Please, call the number ending in 75. Call my sister." Each word felt strangled, yet he kept his gaze fixed on the man, begging him to understand this was his only chance to pull back from the edge. The man startled and stepped back, glancing around as if afraid Hughes might notice. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hands shaken slightly but still quick as he opened the keypad and typed the numbers Malik had whispered. Hughes was still busy yelling at his partners and did not see. When the phone began to ring, the man swallowed hard and switched to speaker, speaking fast through a tight voice. "Are you Raven Malik? Malik is being beaten by the police." His words rang loud enough for several people nearby to snap their heads up in shock, but he did not stop. His eyes locked onto Malik, a silent promise that he would not abandon the man pinned against the car. On the other end, there was none of the panic the man expected. Instead came a sharp silence, then a woman's voice, low, firm, and carrying unmistakable authority. "Say it again. Where is Malik?" The man swallowed. "Jefferson residential area. They said he kidnapped someone, but I saw him helping the old man." He did not finish before her voice, cut in cold as ice and precise. "Stay on the line. I am coming." The short command carried the force of an order no one would dare refuse. As the last syllable left her mouth, the faint roar of an engine sounded through the call as if she had already turned her vehicle around the second she heard Malik's name. No one but Malik understood what that meant. He heard his sister's voice faint through the noise of the scene, yet strong enough to tighten his chest in a different way, not from pain, but from the reassurance it carried. He closed his eyes, his breath thin as a thread, his lips trembling as he released the words he had been holding inside since the beginning. "Sis, help me." The sentence faded the moment it left him, soft yet powerful. The kind of plea that rose from deep inside when he finally understood that even if those around him felt sympathy, none of them could save him the way she could. The man holding the phone looked at Malik with a mix of pity and alarm. The other residents who heard the words my sister whispered among themselves, their expressions shifting, half uncertain and half hopeful, knowing Malik had just reached out to someone close, someone who responded so quickly that even the heavy air around them seemed to shake. They did not know who Raven was, but that voice, sharp and decisive like a blade cutting clean through her wind, made several people shiver. A middle-aged woman near the gate glanced around and murmured, "His sister must be someone important," while the man with the phone pressed himself behind a tree, afraid Hughes would notice, yet ready to provide more information if the person on the line needed it. Hughes finally caught the sound coming from the phone. He turned toward it with a suspicious glare, but before he could step closer, the man's car shifted backward to avoid drawing attention. Malik saw Hughes pivot, his breath tightening with fear that the call might be interrupted, but Raven's voice still carried through the speaker, low and steady. "I am a few minutes away. Hold your position." Those last three words landed like a promise from someone who had pulled Malik out of danger more than once in his life, even though none of those moments looked anything like this quiet street. As Hughes leaned back in to press him down again, Malik felt a hard thump in his chest this time, not from fear, but from knowing Raven was already on the way. That short distance, those few minutes, suddenly became the only thing keeping him from collapsing entirely. Under the evening light shifting toward darkness, Malik closed his eyes once more, not to hide but to brace himself for what was coming. He knew that when Raven arrived, the balance would shift. Not because she was his sister, but because she was Raven Walker, a special forces operator whose presence alone was enough to make abusers of power think twice. And in that quiet neighborhood, at the very moment Malik whispered the most fragile plea of his life, a strong gust of wind swept through as if signaling that the tragedy had reached its limit and that the reckoning awaiting Hughes was drawing closer with every turn of Raven's speeding wheels. The roar of an engine at the end of the street made several residents turn in alarm. A black SUV shot forward and braked hard at the curb, its tires grinding against loose gravel with a sharp screech that sliced through the already tense air. The door flew open, and Raven stepped out like an arrow released from a bow. She moved almost at a run, looking at no one, asking nothing each step, striking the pavement like she was charging into an actual battlefield. The wind pushed pushed her hair back, dust trailed behind her, and her eyes locked onto the single image that ignited every part of her being. Malik pinned to the hood, his wrists turning purple under the crushing metal cuffs. Raven stopped only a few steps from Hughes, her breathing steady, the kind of control earned by someone used to sprinting under pressure. She did not waste time scanning the scene or asking what happened because everything in front of her was already clear. Molly, trembling from pain, mister. Doyle slumped sideways in the back seat, ready to collapse, and Hughes was still pressing down on Malik with the smug confidence of someone who believed he held absolute authority. Raven took one more step, her voice striking through the air with a force that silenced both sides of the street. "Let my brother go." The tone rang like metal hitting metal, the voice of someone who had faced too many situations for manufactured authority to ever intimidate her. Her sudden appearance made Hughes freeze. He lifted his hand from Malik's neck for a brief second, enough for Raven to see the red marks on his skin. Hughes had not yet figured out who she was, but the defensive instinct of someone suddenly challenged kicked in. He turned his voice sharp with arrogance. "I am performing my duty." The words came out reflexively, the attempt of a man afraid of being questioned in front of a crowd. What he did not expect was Raven stepping half a pace closer, so near their breaths, touched her eyes, steady and unmoving. "Your duty does not allow you to assault an innocent civilian," she said, each word carrying the weight of endless hours of training, of facing life and death, of the cold resolve she reserved only for those who misused power. Hughes tried to keep his voice calm, though his breath wavered. "I followed procedure." Raven did not give him the chance to finish. She tilted her head, her eyes sharp as a blade, locked onto his. "What procedure allows you to twist an old man's statement and crush the wrists of someone helping him?" The certainty in her voice hit like a clean strike to the distorted logic Hughes had been clinging to. Behind them, the crowd began murmuring, some nodding, others gasping, as if shocked that someone dared speak to Hughes that way. A woman near her doorway whispered to her neighbor, "Who is she to talk like she is in command?" Hughes heard the whispers, and the familiar sense of authority he relied on began to shake like ground pushed by wind. He wanted to step forward and overpower Raven, to use the posture of a police officer to force her back, but his body reacted differently. When Raven took another half step and met his eyes with the look of someone who demanded truth, Hughes retreated. Only half a step, but enough to make the crowd shift in expression. A man nearby murmured, "He," stepped back. The words rippled through the group, slicing open the pressure that had been building in the air. Raven sensed that shift, but she showed no sign of triumph. She lowered her gaze to Malik, her eyes darkening with anger when she saw his swollen wrists beneath the cuffs. Malik tried to mouth a word, "Sis," but Raven placed a hand on his shoulder, not tight, but steady, protective enough for him to feel it. She lifted her eyes back to Hughes, her voice lower but just as cutting. "You just made the biggest mistake of your day." Hughes tightened his grip on the flashlight at his belt, as if trying to hold on to the last scraps of authority, but the eyes around them were no longer on his side. They watched Raven like a sudden force of wind tearing into the scene, pulling forward every suppressed emotion and every fear that had been kept silent. His confidence shook again. His shoulders tensed, and he looked away for a brief second before turning back toward Malik. Raven straightened her voice, striking each word with the weight of a command no one dared resist. "Step away from my brother." And for the first time since the confrontation began, Hughes could not hide his uncertainty. Verbal defiance was no longer a safe option, and aggression could no longer control the situation. The entire street seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what a Navy SEAL would do to the man who had pushed her brother to the edge of despair. Raven stood in the middle of the street like an unbreakable wall, her posture straight, her eyes locked onto Hughes with a force that pulled the entire row of houses into a breathless silence. Malik still had his head lowered, his breath trembling from the metallic taste lingering in his throat after being pressed against the hood for so long. Raven placed one hand on his shoulder, keeping him within her protection, then turned fully toward Hughes. "Remove the cuffs," she said, her voice so low and heavy it felt like each word struck the pavement. Now, it was not a shout, not a request, but the command of someone accustomed to standing in positions where others had no choice but to listen. Hughes froze for a moment, his shoulders tensing, a flicker of defiance burning in his eyes. He looked Raven up and down as if trying to decide whether she had the authority to order him in front of the crowd surrounding them. "You have no authority here," he said, his voice pressed low as if he could bury her under the weight of his uniform. But even in his forced calm, Raven could see the tremor beneath it, the crack in the confidence he tried to wear. He stepped half a pace back like someone torn between charging into a fight or retreating to salvage whatever pride he still had. Raven did not blink. The evening light cast across her cheek, sharpening the cold edge Malik jokingly called her steel face. She lifted her hand from Malik's shoulder and placed it on the grip of the gun at her hip. A small movement, but the air snapped tight, as if someone had pulled a wire to the point of vibrating. Raven did not draw it, but the placement alone was enough to remind Hughes of everything. He could not ignore her ability to counter, to restrain, to overpower, and to turn this moment into a nightmare if he chose the wrong step. "I have authority when you abuse yours," Raven said, her voice low and cold, each word stabbing straight into the thin layer of pride Hughes had left. "I will count to 3. Her face did not shift. Her gaze did not leave his, the gaze of someone who had stared down opponents far stronger and still forced them back. Some residents held their breath, and a few raised their hands to their mouths, convinced she might actually draw the weapon. A middle-aged woman pressed her back to the gate, whispering to her neighbor without looking away from Raven. "She knows exactly what she's doing." Raven lifted one finger and began counting, her voice steady like a war drum. 1. Hughes blinked, his lips tightening as he fought to steady himself. Beside him, a young officer swallowed hard, glancing at Hughes, then at Raven with a shocked expression. Raven did not move even an inch, her hand resting on the gun grip like a warning sharper than anything she had said so far. 2. Behind her, Malik drew in a short breath as the cuffs dug deeper into his wrists. He felt the tension pushing the air to its limit, but he also saw in Raven's eyes a calm that bordered on unreal, the same confidence he had seen dozens of times when she faced danger in missions he only ever heard about. The crowd surrounding them began stirring, several people stepping a little closer, as if they wanted to witness the exact moment when the balance of power finally tipped. Hughes tightened his grip on the flashlight at his hip, as though trying to summon authority, but his hand stalled midway. Sweat gathered at his temple, whether from heat, confusion, or fear, one could not tell. The silence stretched second by second, and Raven stood there without adding another word. She did not need to. Her silence alone stripped away the last footing Hughes had been clinging to. Then Raven lowered her voice even more, a short sentence that chilled the spines of those closest to her 3. Hughes swallowed hard. For the first time since the beginning, he had no choice that felt solid. He looked at Malik, at the bruised wrists straining in the cuffs. He looked at Mr. Doyle, trembling in the back seat. He looked at the crowd watching him. And most of all, he looked at Raven, standing like a poised spear, ready to pierce through every excuse he could muster. In that instant, Hughes's hand trembled enough for the crowd to see. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cuff key, and stepped toward Malik in a silence swallowed by the weight of everyone's attention. The metallic click echoed down the street like a strike to Hughes's pride. Malik reflexively pulled his hands back, the sting in his wrists sharp, but nothing compared to the relief of being freed from the senseless pressure the man had forced on him. Hughes avoided Raven's eyes, his hand hanging low, the cuffs dangling with a faint rattle, like tapping on the layers of guilt he had tried to bury. Raven stepped half a pace back to support Malik, her voice steady, steel on the outside and soft only for him. "Get up, Malik." Malik lifted his face, his breathing slowly settling, and when he saw Raven standing in front of him, his eyes softened as if he had finally found something solid to hold on to. And Hughes, for the first time all afternoon, stood silent, because his own actions had already revealed everything. Raven did not need paperwork or a badge. She needed only the truth, and the power of that truth was enough to force a man abusing his authority to step back with nothing left to say. The moment the cuffs clicked off Malik's wrists, several nearby residents rushed toward the open rear door of the sedan where Mr. Doyle sat slumped, his breath broken and his face pale from the prolonged dizziness. A quick-thinking man slid an arm around his shoulder, helping him out of the car and guiding him toward the stone bench beneath the large tree in the front yard. A woman hurriedly twisted open a bottle of water and set it into his trembling hand, her movements gentle but urgent, as if every passing second mattered. Mr. Doyle lifted the bottle with shaky fingers and drank in small sips, his breathing slowly evening out, his clouded eyes beginning to regain some focus. The surrounding group watched him intently, worried and eager for clarity, each one hoping his words would finally explain the wrongness they had felt ever since the incident began. Malik stood close, his hands still pressed to the marks on his wrists, his eyes tracking every small movement from Mr. Doyle, clinging to the fragile hope that the truth would finally be restored. Raven placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, her gaze shifting to study the old man's complexion, assessing his condition with the instinct she had carried from years in uniform. She stepped half a pace back for a clearer view as Mr. Doyle lifted his head, his eyes drifting across the crowd before settling on Malik, emotion rising on his worn face. "He saved me," he said, his voice hoarse, but each word sharp and clear like a tap on the thin glass that should have cracked long ago. The entire crowd fell silent, every small conversation cut off by the weight of that single sentence. Mr. Doyle continued, his voice steadier now as someone supported his back. "I asked him for a ride. I was dizzy. I could not stand. I saw his car and waved. He helped me into the seat." Malik drew in a deep breath, the words cooling the burn that had been roaring inside his chest. Raven looked at Mr. Doyle with gratitude, then at Malik, confirming that what she believed had been right all along. Across the street, Hughes stiffened at every clear syllable, his eyes locked on the old man with the expression of someone watching a truth shatter the lie he had built like thin ice beneath his feet. A middle-aged woman near the bench instinctively placed a hand on her chest and said, "I saw him wave the car down." Her voice was not loud, but it spread quickly through the circle of onlookers. Another resident nodded. "Yes, I was across the street. I saw him calling out to the young man." The confirmations kept coming, one after another, like falling dominoes breaking apart the false wall Hughes had constructed from the start. Malik heard each one, his throat tightening with overwhelming relief. He said nothing, but his eyes lowered with emotion as if silently thanking every person helping the truth find its way back home. Raven stepped closer to Mr. Doyle, lowering herself slightly so her eyes were level with his, her voice steady and grounded like someone who had just found the decisive piece in a critical case. "Say it again for me," she said as she pulled out her phone, her tone calm but weighted. "Malik helped you, correct?" Mr. Doyle nodded weakly. "He saved me. He did not force me, did not pull me at all." Raven tapped the record button and held the phone nearer to ensure every syllable he spoke was captured clearly. She spoke slowly, wanting everyone around them to hear, which means the initial statement was distorted. Those words were sharp as a newly honed blade slicing through the air. Several residents turned toward Hughes, their expressions shifting from doubt to anger. A young man near the curb shook his head. "So he really meant to do it from the start." An older woman clutched her purse tighter, her lips trembling with outrage, beating an innocent man and then making up a story. Even the two young officers who had arrived with Hughes looked unsettled, exchanging glances, neither daring to step forward now that the situation was clearly slipping out of control. Hughes took half a step forward, his mouth opening as if to interrupt the recording, but when Raven's eyes lifted toward him, the look she gave froze him mid-motion as if an invisible barrier had stopped him. Raven slipped her phone back into her pocket, then stood straight, her shoulders squared and steady like she had just reaffirmed full control of the scene. Malik remained quietly behind her, rubbing the sore marks on his wrists, but his chest felt warmer now, no longer hollow with the despair that had wrapped around him minutes earlier. The evidence was finally tilting toward the truth, and the truth, for the first time in that suffocating afternoon, came came from the very person who had endured the chaos, an old man with barely enough strength to sit upright, yet still determined to speak so that no one would be wrongly condemned. Silence spread across half the street, and in that moment even the wind through the branches softened as if the air itself had eased now that a heavy weight had been lifted from the scene. Raven stood in the narrow courtyard of the neighborhood, her shadow stretching across the pavement as the afternoon light tilted down, revealing the steel-cold expression of someone who had lived through too many life-and-death situations to tolerate the abuse of power unfolding before her. Malik leaned against the car, his wrists still bruised but his breathing steadier thanks to her presence. Mr. Doyle sat on the bench sipping water to stay alert while the crowd spread into a natural arc around the scene as if they knew something important was about to be set straight. Every gaze was on Raven, and in that silence the weight of what she was about to say tightened the air around them. Raven stepped forward, standing tall in front of Hughes. She was not much taller than he, yet her presence shifted the balance her side, holding the grounded control of a trained soldier, while his side held the clumsy panic hidden beneath a forced calm. "You never asked why he was dizzy," Raven said, her voice low and precise, "and you never assessed the victim's condition before making any assumption." The first sentence alone sent a small jolt through the crowd because everyone knew it was true. Hughes clenched his jaw and looked away, trying to dodge the sharp accusation cutting directly into his wrongdoing. Raven continued. She pointed to the bench where Mr. Doyle sat, his hand still trembling even after water and comfort from the neighbors. He almost collapsed in the street, his head spinning, his breathing unstable. "That is someone who needs medical evaluation, not someone to be yelled at." Her voice was steady but heavy enough to make Hughes tighten his jaw again, a small twitch at his neck showing how hard he was fighting to control his reaction. "A trained officer," Raven went on, "would recognize staggering from low blood pressure, would see the pale complexion as a warning sign. But you did not observe, you did not ask, you did not check." The crowd murmured, several people exchanging looks as if confirming what they had quietly suspected. Hughes stood rigid, his hand on his duty belt, trembling slightly as though someone had pressed on a hidden bruise. Raven moved a little closer, just enough to force Hughes to look her directly in the eyes. "You questioned with bias," she said, her tone unchanged, "and you made your conclusion the moment you stepped out of that patrol car." Malik froze for a second, and hearing that, because it was exactly what he had lived through moment by moment. "You didn't ask, are you all right?" Raven said. "You asked, were you forced into the car?" She emphasized the final sentence as if she wanted Hughes to hear the corrupt script he had created. "That question was not to find the truth," Raven continued, "but to lead the victim into the answer you wanted." Her words fell heavy, undeniable, and in the stillness that followed, every person present understood that the lie Hughes had built had just been cleanly torn apart. A man near the fence whispered, "That's right, I heard him. He asked exactly that." A young woman nodded, gripping her phone tightly in anger. Each confirmation was another cut into the mask Hughes had been struggling to keep intact. His facial muscles twitched, his eyes unsteady as Raven drove deeper into the way he had twisted the truth. "You ignored the real statement," Raven said clearly, "and replaced it with your assumption." She gestured toward Mr. Doyle, who watched them with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. He said, "I got in on my own, and you cut him off, then rushed to write in your report that he was forced." Raven's voice was not loud, but each word hit the air like a hammer, landing directly on the tension in every listener's chest. Malik felt the truth finally pushing its way back into place, like a powerful stream breaking free after being clogged with dirt. Mr. Doyle bowed his head slightly, confirming what Raven said, his lips trembling. I said, but Raven gave him a small nod, assuring him he did not need to push himself any further. Hughes swallowed the movement so obvious that the crowd saw it and sensed the fear rising inside him. He opened his mouth, ready to say something, maybe to justify himself, maybe to twist the situation again, but Raven did not give him the chance. "And after all those failures," she said, her tone sharp as a blade, "you used force on an innocent man. even though you had no evidence beyond the assumptions you invented. A ripple of outrage swept through the crowd. A man shouted, "I saw him helping the old man." An elderly woman threw a furious glare at Hughes. Even the two young officers beside him looked shaken, their eyes wavering as Raven listed the violations they had been trying not to acknowledge, unwilling to confront their superior. But the truth was unfolding in front of them in a way none of them could deny. Raven stood tall, her shoulders carrying the force of someone who had lived through too many battles between life and death to allow hesitation. "You acted not out of duty," she concluded. "You acted out of bias." Her voice was low and firm like a needle, piercing straight through Hughes's uniform, and into the fear he tried hardest to hide. Malik felt those words like a turning point, a moment when the dark door Hughes had been holding shut all afternoon was thrown open, letting everyone finally see the truth behind it. Hughes grew paler with every word she spoke. The muscles in his face twitched as if he were being forced to stand under a spotlight aimed directly at his mistakes. Sweat formed at his temples even though the air was not warm. The excuses he had always relied on to shield his own authoritarian behavior no longer had any ground to stand on. Each sentence from Raven felt like another weight dropped onto his shoulders, making it difficult for him to stand straight, making even his breathing feel heavier. His eyes flicked toward Malik for a brief second, and instead of the defiance he had shown earlier, there was now a trace of unease hiding in the back of his gaze. Raven watched him for several seconds, long enough to ensure that everyone present saw the truth clearly. She did not need to shout, did not need to raise her hands, did not need to threaten anything. The truth itself had become the weapon. And every point she had laid out was not meant to crush Hughes, but to restore justice to Malik, to Mr. Doyle, and to everything that had been warped under the weight of misused authority. The air after Raven's breakdown of the situation felt different. A tense silence stretching across the street, and from that silence the residents who had been watching in helpless frustration began to gather their courage. A middle-aged man, thin but sharp-eyed, stepped past the crowd and spoke with a voice so clear that everyone turned toward him. "I saw him help the old man first." He crossed his arms, his stare fixed directly on Hughes, firm enough to push aside the fear that had kept him silent earlier. "I was standing on my porch," he added. "I saw the old man stumble and almost fall. The young man caught him in time. There was no forcing here." The statement was short, but its weight made Hughes's face twitch, as if someone had struck a deep, unprotected point. An older woman, round-figured and still holding the bundle of vegetables she had just bought, stepped forward from near the bench. She leaned slightly, her hand trembling as she recalled what she had witnessed. "I heard the old man thank him," she said, her voice shaky, but each word clear. She placed a hand on her chest, her breathing heavy but her eyes bright with the determination to defend what was right. As soon as he sat down, he said, "Thank you, son. I heard it clearly. If the boy did something wrong, why would the old man say that?" She looked at Malik with warm eyes like a mother seeing a child being wronged. Malik lowered his head in response, his throat tightening because the truth he had tried to protect was finally being spoken aloud by people he had never met, but whose hearts were in the right place. A young worker, his shirt stained with paint, stepped out from behind the crowd. He raised a hand and spoke firmly. There was no fighting or struggling at all. His voice projected so strongly that even those farther away turned to look. "I was across the street and I saw everything from when he stopped the car until the police arrived. He lifted the old man into the seat. He did not pull him. And when the man sat down, I heard him ask if he was okay." The worker fixed his eyes on Hughes as he continued. "And this so-called forcing you put in the report, I did not see it anywhere." His tone was solid as stone, neither shaken nor retreating. The circle of people grew louder. A voice from the far end of the porch called out, "I was at my window. I saw him wave the car over." Another voice added, "The old man was weak. He wanted help. Nobody was kidnapping anyone." Testimony after testimony emerged from different directions, each person with their own angle, their own line, yet all of them pointed to the same conclusion: Hughes had twisted the truth. Together Together, the statements wove into a thick net, tightening around Hughes, choking off every excuse he had been clinging to. Raven stood still, watching, her eyes moving from person to person as if she meant to remember every word and every face that had found the courage to speak up. People who just a minute earlier had still been afraid of the authority wrapped in a uniform. She didn't interrupt, didn't guide them, only stood there as an anchor so they could voice what was right on their own. Malik watched the scene, with his chest loosening after what felt like a long walk through darkness. He saw strangers standing on his side, saw the truth become something no longer twisted by another man's voice, and he breathed in deeper, the sting in his wrists feeling a little lighter. Hughes stood hunched, his shoulders drooping slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he were clinging to the last threads of composure. He scanned the crowd, hoping to find at least one face still willing to believe him, but all he found were dozens of eyes staring back with the heavy judgment of people who had seen the truth bent and wanted to see him held accountable. The late afternoon light cut across his face, deepening the lines around his eyes, washing his complexion into a pale shade of someone cornered with nowhere left to turn. One of the young officers beside Hughes began to fidget. He swallowed hard as the testimonies echoed around them, then looked toward Hughes as if waiting for an explanation. But Hughes stayed silent, his hand tightening unconsciously around his duty belt, his gaze drifting away as each witness stepped forward. The authority he had used to cover his misconduct was being stripped away piece by piece, and for the first time since stepping out of the patrol car, he could no longer hide behind the shield of protocol. The independent testimonies weren't noise. They were a truth confirmed from multiple angles, and their combined force shattered every excuse Hughes had left. A young woman whispered to her friend, "How's he gonna cover this up now?" Another nodded. Too many people saw. He really messed up. Raven stepped back half a pace, placing herself squarely between Malik and Hughes, her gaze settling on him in a quiet, heavy way, like the weight of a verdict not yet spoken aloud. Malik looked at Hughes, not with hatred, but with the eyes of someone who had been pushed to the bottom of injustice, and had watched the truth claw its way back into the light. Mr. Doyle lifted his head, his weary eyes filled with gratitude for the people who had spoken when he couldn't, and Hughes, standing under the pressure of every gaze aimed at him, went rigid, his face stiffening, as if every layer of wrongdoing he'd tried to hide had just been peeled back. He had no words left. Everything he had written in his report, everything he had shouted at Malik, was now drowned beneath a flood of clear, strong, honest voices from the neighbors around them. The independent testimonies had crushed every defense, and from that moment on, the street was no longer on Hughes's side. Truth had claimed its rightful place. Raven turned back toward Malik, her eyes softening at the sight of the weight lifting from him. And Malik, for the first time that entire afternoon, drew in a full breath without feeling his chest tighten. The wail of a police siren rose from the far end of the street, slicing through the chatter as the crowd murmured among themselves. The SUV from the District Oversight Unit pulled up at the curb, the door opening to reveal a middle-aged man striding out with a quick, firm, decisive step. It was Chief Williams, known across the city for being fair blunt and notoriously intolerant of any form of abuse of power. His face was stern, his eyes sweeping across the scene where Raven stood, shielding Malik. Hughes stood rigid across from her, and the crowd clustered around Mr. Doyle. With just a single glance, Williams saw this was no longer a standard arrest, but a confrontation that had veered off course from the very beginning. He walked straight to the two young officers, first signaling for them to step aside. In a low but steady voice, he said, "Brief me." One of the officers immediately recounted everything from the moment they arrived, though his voice trembled with the leftover confusion of the situation. Williams listened without interrupting, nodding slowly as each detail landed in his mind like puzzle pieces he needed to put back into order. He turned to Hughes, his expression sharpening at the sight of the man's pale, drawn face. Then he faced the crowd. Did anyone witness the beginning, he asked. The moment the words left his mouth, dozens of hands shot into the air like arrows released from drawn bows. Williams beckoned several people forward, instructing them to speak one at a time so he could hear everything clearly without overlap. He listened as the man from the porch described Malik catching Mr. Doyle before he fell, then, as the older woman recounted hearing Mr. Doyle say "thank you" as soon as he got into the car. Williams stored each detail, his attention never wavering from their faces as if he were reading truth and emotion side by side. When the painter explained that there had been no struggle or coercion at all, Williams inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly like he was finally seeing the real picture after it had been distorted for too long. At last he stepped toward the bench where Mr. Doyle sat. Leaning down, he asked gruffly, "Can you tell me what happened before the officers arrived?" Mr. Doyle, though exhausted, looked at Williams with newly steadied eyes, thanks to the care from the neighbors around him. "He helped me," he said, his voice clearer than before. "I was dizzy, so I waved him down. He helped me into the car. No one forced anything." Williams placed a hand gently on the old man's shoulder, nodded in thanks, then straightened up, brushing a bit of dust from his pant leg as though readying himself for the next heavier step. When he turned toward Hughes, the entire street fell silent. Raven stood beside Malik, arms folded, her gaze locked on Hughes. Malik stood taller now, still aching, but steadied by his sister's presence and the justice finally taking shape around him. Hughes met Williams's stare and flinched slightly before forcing himself back into a stiff posture. "Chief, I was following procedure," he said quickly. The words strained his voice hoarse as if he were clinging to something already collapsing beneath him. Williams did not respond immediately. He reached out and accepted the notebook Hughes had written in earlier, flipped through several pages, and narrowed his eyes at each line. He read for a few seconds, then lifted his head, comparing what he had just seen with what he'd heard from the witnesses. "You wrote that the victim confirmed being forced," Williams said slowly, pressing each word, "yet at least 4 witness accounts and the victim himself state the opposite." Hughes opened his mouth to protest, but Williams raised a hand, signaling silence. "You also wrote that the suspect showed signs of resisting, yet, according to witnesses, he was pinned against the car from the very start." Williams paused for several seconds, his gaze drilling straight into Hughes. "And worst of all, you never assessed the old man's medical condition." Hughes stepped back half a pace, his shoulders curling inward as if to shield himself. Sweat dotted his forehead, becoming more visible as Williams moved a bit closer. "Several procedural violations," Williams said clearly, his voice lowering in a way that made everyone nearby feel the weight of the moment. "I am stripping you of command authority immediately." A ripple went through the crowd, small gasps and murmured disbelief as people turned toward Hughes, stunned to witness what many thought they'd never see. Hughes's eyes widened, his face draining to an ashen gray as the words hit him. "Chief, no, I was set up," he choked out, sounding like a man clawing at the edge of a cliff. Williams frowned. "Set up by whom?" The question was simple, yet sharp as a needle, piercing through the thin veil of excuses. Hughes opened his mouth again, but no words came. That silence itself became evidence stronger than anything Williams had gathered from the witnesses. Raven folded her arms and tilted her head slightly, saying nothing, but a nearly invisible curve at the edge of her mouth suggested she had known this moment would come. Williams turned to the 2 young officers. "Escort Officer Hughes back to the station and file a full incident report." His tone was calm, but carried the unmistakable edge of a battlefield order. The young officers moved toward Hughes at once. They didn't cuff him because Williams hadn't commanded it, but the look in their eyes made it clear that the only authority Hughes had relied on moments before had just been stripped away right here on the street. Hughes stood frozen for several seconds, his gaze flicking from Raven to Malik, to the onlookers, then down at the pavement as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. His lips trembled as though he wanted to say something to lessen the humiliation rising across his face, but in the end he lowered his head, his complexion pale like a cold wind had swept through him. Raven stepped closer to Malik, adjusted his shirt gently, then looked toward Williams. He gave a small nod, a quiet signal that the truth had finally begun settling back into its rightful place. Malik inhaled deeply, his chest expanding as though the weight trapping him minutes earlier had been lifted layer by layer. On the bench, Mr. Doyle watched the scene with eyes brimming perhaps from relief that his words had finally helped. The arrival of Williams had completely shifted the balance, and with Hughes temporarily relieved of authority, the entire street felt as though it had finally been freed from the shadow of distorted power that had smothered it through the long, exhausting afternoon. That same afternoon, just after the last witnesses left the police station courtyard, a line of vehicles bearing the insignia of Internal Affairs rolled through the gates, one by Un-E-E. The doors opened, and the investigators stepped out with the stern expressions of people long accustomed to confronting the rawest truths of the profession. They needed no escort. All preliminary reports and temporary documentation had already been forwarded to them. Their presence alone made the building feel tighter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Some officers slipped deeper into their offices to avoid the probing eyes, while others stood rigidly in place, fully aware that what happened next would determine the reputation of the entire department. Malik sat in the waiting room near the main entrance with Raven beside him like a protective shadow. Neither of them spoke, yet both could feel the shift in the air. Gone was the earlier panic and chaos, replaced by the solemn quiet of an institution beginning to operate under full transparency. Malik touched his wrist, where the bruised imprint of the handcuffs remained a faint purple line running along the bone. Raven followed the movement with her eyes and murmured, "Today is only the beginning." Malik nodded, his gaze fixed down the hallway toward the open records room where Internal Affairs investigators had begun turning over each sheet of paper. Inside the wide room, an older investigator sat at a long wooden table, red pen in hand, marking page after page collected from prior cases. "This report," he said, sliding a stack toward his colleague, "bases its conclusions entirely on assumption. No witness statements attached, no verification from fellow officers." The younger investigator leaned down to review it, his face darkening. Red marks began to multiply across the pages like reopened wounds on a system that had quietly ignored them. Another file was opened. 17th of last month, an investigator read aloud. Hughes wrote that the stopped driver attempted to flee. He paused when he reached the margin notes which held the detained man's statement. But witnesses say he stood still because one leg was injured. The investigator's hand trembled slightly with anger at the sheer irrationality. Stacks of documents formed three growing piles: distorted reports, subjective conclusions, and repeated violations. They rose higher by the minute, each pile becoming undeniable proof that Hughes had not simply misjudged or made a one-time mistake. These were systemic behavior. In the corner of the room, two female investigators were reviewing every report related to black individuals in the area. They found an abnormal pattern. Most of the cases Hughes documented targeted black people, even though they were not the group with the highest rate of violations according to overall statistics. One of the investigators lifted her hand and pointed at a slanted note in a report. Suspicious attitude. She looked at her colleague and said, "This is his usual justification." And in all the files beneath it, they saw similar phrases repeated over and over like traces of prejudice, framed as professional language. Raven stood at the doorway listening to each exchange, and the more she heard, the clearer it became that today was not only about clearing Malik's name, it was about ending a pattern of abuse that had gone on far too long. As older files were opened, long-buried stories resurfaced. One incident from 2 years prior involved a high school student accused accused of suspicious behavior right in front of the school building simply for standing and talking with a friend. Another involved a middle-aged man pulled out of his car and searched because of a matching tip description even though he was on his way to the hospital to visit his wife. All of those reports carried the same signature, and that was what pushed the investigators to continue marking the files with red ink. While they continued reviewing, a young investigator paused at an unusual report. "Wrongful arrest of a black motorist," he said, reading the first line aloud. He was handcuffed in front of his young son, but the report states, "resisted." He tapped his finger on the paper, but the witness statement attached says he only asked why he was being stopped. Raven's brows drew together, her eyes shifting to Malik, as if reminding him of what he had just gone through. Malik looked down at the floor, struck by a feeling both foreign and painfully familiar tightening in his chest. He understood then that what had happened to him was not a random incident. It was part of a repeated pattern, years in the making. The review continued until the end of the day. Investigators rose one by one, their eyes shadowed with exhaustion but sharpened by clarity. When all documentation had been gathered, the lead internal affairs investigator placed his hand on the thick stack before him and delivered a short conclusion, but one heavy enough to silence anyone within earshot. Systemic abuse of authority. Not suspicion, not minor error. Abuse repeated across many years, affecting many people, leaving long-lasting consequences. The lead investigator stepped into the hallway where Malik and Raven were waiting. The late afternoon light fell across his face, making every crease stand out like proof of the exhaustion of a man who had witnessed too many wrongs yet never given up. He looked at Malik and nodded slowly. "You need to know that what happened today has opened an investigation unlike anything this district has ever seen," he said, his voice calm but weighted. Malik felt his heart strike a heavy beat, as if an invisible noose had finally loosened. Raven stepped forward, her eyes sharp but her voice softer than usual. "What matters now is helping every victim speak up," she said. "No one should stand alone the way Malik once did." The lead investigator nodded. "We have documented everything," he replied, "and it will all be sent to the prosecuting office. Justice must follow its proper course." The witnesses left the hallway as though setting down a burden. They were not joyful, but their eyes were far lighter. The teenager from earlier walked up to Malik, offered his hand, and when Malik clasped it, he smiled like someone who had regained a piece of faith he thought he had lost. The woman, who had steadied her elderly neighbor, bowed her head to Raven and murmured, "Thank you for giving us enough courage to speak up." Raven did not answer with words, but with a look that showed she understood how much strength it had taken for them to say it. As the hallway emptied, the day's last light streamed through the windows in long golden bands across the floor. Malik stood still for a moment, feeling the coolness rising from the tiles through the worn soles of his shoes. He did not speak, but Raven knew he was thinking of the people who had stood with him, people he had never met before today. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Tomorrow it continues." Malik drew in a deep breath, then lifted his head, his eyes steadier. Today had exposed the darkest corners of the system, but it had also revealed the strength of a community when they chose to stand up. Files once buried under a familiar signature were now brought into the open. Voices once overlooked were now entered into the official record. And from this moment forward, the actions once assumed to be hidden forever had been marked with two undeniable words: abuse of authority. No denial, no erasure. Malik walked out of the building with Raven beside him. The evening air had softened, a light breeze brushing through his hair. Within him, the suffocating weight that had pushed him to despair gave way to a new belief. The belief that truth, no matter how difficult, always finds a way into the light. And he, once treated like a criminal simply for helping a frail man, now stood as living proof that justice can still prevail no matter how winding the path. That afternoon, right after the investigative hearing ended, the crowd still gathered in front of the police station as if they refused to leave before hearing the final confirmation. The air carried a mix of anticipation and tension, because everyone understood that the next moment would decide whether justice would truly be returned to Malik. The same people who had watched him being handcuffed and pinned against the hood now stood closer together, no longer fearful but united. Mr. Doyle sat on a stone bench near the flower bed, supported by a relative, his face still pale, but his eyes filled with certainty. Raven stood beside Malik, not in a protective stance anymore, but as someone witnessing a moment her brother fully deserved. Chief Williams stepped out from the main hall of the building and stood behind the small wooden podium where the department's spokesperson usually spoke. The wind lifted the strip of yellow tape on the steps, making a faint rustling sound. He scanned the crowd, his eyes moving across every face before stopping on Malik. There was seriousness in his expression, but no defensiveness, replaced instead by the weight of someone preparing to say the words he knew he should have said long ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the small speakers above. "Based on the findings of the investigation and all verified evidence, I declare that Malik Carter is innocent." When those words were spoken, the space seemed to burst into whispers that quickly rose into a wave of applause rolling across the courtyard. Some men gripped each other's hands tightly. Several women nodded with force, as if freeing themselves from days of pent-up frustration after seeing Malik pressed against the car. Raven turned her head toward Malik, her eyes flickering with pride and emotion. Williams lifted a hand for silence so he could continue. "I want to offer an apology on behalf of the police department," he said, his voice dropping into a tone that made it clear he was not speaking out of formality. "The misconduct of someone under my command caused severe harm to an innocent man, and I, as the head of this agency, am responsible for that." There was a rare sincerity in the way he bowed his head, leaving many people wide-eyed because they were not used to seeing such gestures from those in authority. Malik stood there with his shoulders trembling faintly as he heard the apology. He was not stunned out of simple emotion, but because in recent days he had nearly lost the belief that the words "I am sorry" would ever be spoken by people who once stood on the side of power instead of truth. When Williams raised his head again, his eyes locked directly on Malik. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice weighted, "you went through an ordeal no one should ever face, especially when your actions came from kindness and responsibility toward another person." The crowd applauded again, this time lower in tone, but fuller and unified. A small elderly woman standing beside Doyle wiped her tears and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "That boy did what anyone should do. You can't let someone like him be treated that way." Doyle nodded his hand, trembling slightly as he lifted it, as if wanting to add something, though his health did not allow him to stand for long. Raven looked at Malik with eyes softer than usual. She saw clearly the exhaustion in him, but also the faint light returning in the eyes that had darkened after the events of the previous day. Everything Malik had endured, from being pulled away from the car door to having false accusations written into a report, was now eased by this final acknowledgement. It could not erase the bruises on his wrist or the moments he felt the whole world had turned against him, but it returned to him something he thought he had lost: dignity. When the applause faded, Malik stepped forward, took a deep breath, and spoke. His voice was not loud, but carried clearly like a line, pulling the attention of the entire courtyard back to him. "I only helped a man," he said, pausing for a few seconds before continuing. "Yet my whole life almost got destroyed." The people standing near him bowed their heads or placed their hands over their hearts as if to share a piece of the bitterness in his words. "I never thought a kind act could make me look like a criminal. But today I understand that the reason I made it through wasn't luck. It was because of the people who dared to speak the truth." His words made the residents who had spoken up in the morning nod all at once. They were not heroes, not people with power, but their courage had helped Malik reclaim his honor. A young man who had once been a victim of Hughes lowered his hands, crossed them over his chest, and murmured, "He's right." A woman pressed her lips together and wiped away tears while the teenager, whose bicycle had been confiscated, looked at Malik as if seeing a stronger version of himself. Raven stepped up beside Malik, saying nothing, but her presence alone made it clear that the siblings had gone through too much in too short a time. Malik turned to her as if thanking her with his eyes, then faced everyone again. Chief Williams stepped down from the small podium, walked up to Malik, and extended his hand. Malik looked at it for a few seconds, then took it. It was not a friendly handshake, but a handshake between two people who understood that truth must be protected through action, not empty words. Camera shutters clicked somewhere in the crowd, but no one cared about angles or perfect images. What mattered was that this moment marked a man reclaiming his honor and a community regaining its faith in justice. As the event was about to end, Malik turned to the crowd, his voice no longer strained but clear and steady. "I learned that kindness will always matter, but sometimes it needs strength to protect it. I thank everyone who stood up today, not to help me, but to help this town stay on the right path." When he finished speaking, the applause surged again, stronger than all the times before. No one standing there believed they were cheering for a hero. They were cheering for the truth. They were cheering for kindness. And they were cheering for an ordinary man who proved that even a simple act can hold the power to change an entire community. In that moment, under the slanting afternoon light touching the steps of the police station, Malik Carter was no longer the man who had almost been swallowed by disaster. He was the one who stood up, held on to his kindness, and walked through a storm he once thought would never end. Raven stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching, as if to remind him that no matter how hard the journey becomes, when one person stands up, others will follow. And from that moment on, Malik's honor was not restored by a piece of paper or a decision, but by the trust of the community, the unity of its people, and the courage passed from one person to another. A fitting conclusion to a journey full of trials but also full of light. When the investigation panel's statements had just concluded, atmosphere in the meeting room was starting to settle, and a small movement from the last row drew everyone's attention. A woman stood up, her frame slender, but her eyes heavy as if holding something inside for far too long. She walked slowly to the center aisle, her hands clasped together from tension, yet her voice carried a determination that years of silence could no longer suppress. "I want to say something," she spoke, her gaze shifting from Malik to Raven, as if to make sure nothing she was about to reveal needed to be hidden anymore. The room fell even quieter than when the verdict was announced. She drew in a breath and said, "Hughes once threatened to arrest me because I helped my elderly neighbor after she fell in front of her house." The words fell into the room like a long-buried memory being unearthed, carrying with it the thick dust of fear. She explained that the elderly woman had slipped by the front door that day, her knee bleeding after hitting the ground hard. When she helped her into the house to clean the wound, Hughes appeared out of nowhere and demanded to know where she was taking the victim. She tried to explain, but Hughes didn't give her the chance. He said, "I was interfering with an investigation." She continued, her voice trembling but steady. "I remember shaking so hard I couldn't stand straight, but I still thought if I explained he'd understand." She pressed her lips together, blinking fast to keep tears from falling. But he didn't listen. He wrote his report based on what he believed, not what I said. People in the room murmured softly, their eyes shifting to one another as they recognized how closely her story resembled what had happened to Malik. Malik sat there, feeling each detail strike something inside him like distant memories he had never lived, but somehow knew because they all came from the same source, Hughes's coercive assumption. Raven watched the woman, her gaze no longer sharp, like when she confronted Hughes, but calm and steady like a soldier quietly listening to the pain of a civilian after the battle had passed. When the woman returned to her seat, a young man stepped forward. He looked to be in his early 20s, broad-shouldered and strong, but his eyes carried the wary look of someone who had been forced too many times to defend himself against baseless suspicion. He stood upright, took a breath, and said, "He accused me of stealing just because I'm black." The room seemed to sink a degree lower. His voice didn't shake. It was tightly controlled anger. He described how he walked out of a store with a bag of items he had paid for, but Hughes stopped him and emptied his pockets while his face was pushed against the cold brick wall. No one asked if he needed a lawyer. No one checked if he was hurt. Hughes wrote in the report that he attempted to flee, even though the young man said he stood completely still because he was too stunned to move. An older woman in the corner nodded repeatedly, and a man nearby closed his eyes as if remembering something similar he had witnessed but never dared to speak about. Many whispers rose and then faded when a timid teenager stepped forward. His face was young, but his eyes seemed older than his age from carrying a fear far too big for a child. I was threatened by him too," he said, his hands tightly clenched together. "I was standing outside a store waiting for my friend. He said I was watching for a chance to steal. When I denied it, he said he would take my bicycle if I didn't tell the truth." The room stirred, several people exhaling sharply in anger. A few parents seated in the back looked at the boy with pity, as if seeing their own children in his place and feeling unable to bear it. Those accounts, though coming from different people, sounded strangely identical, as if copied from the same template. Raven noticed it first. She swept her gaze across all the witnesses and said, "Every pattern is the same." She listed slowly. Prejudice, she said, the word landing like a blade against the table. Imposition, she continued, her tone flat but razor sharp. And falsifying the truth. Everyone in the room understood she was not exaggerating. They had heard each story, each detail, each twisted sentence. It was no longer a coincidence, but a systematic wrong that Hughes had repeated on people who did not have the strength to fight back. Malik turned to look at those who had just stepped forward. He had never known them before, had no connection to their lives, yet now they stood beside him like pieces that revealed his experience had followed a familiar pattern. They did not speak out for revenge or to vent anger, but because they finally felt they were no longer alone. Malik, standing you, had made them brave enough to stop living in silence. Raven stepped into the center of the room and looked at each of them as if confirming that their stories mattered. "I will help all of you file formal complaints," she said. There was no raised voice or fury in her tone, only the certainty of someone who understood that protecting justice does not end with one case. A woman burst into tears, not from sadness, but from relief. A young man nodded firmly as if reclaiming a faith he thought he had lost. The small teenager tightened his fists, his expression no longer fearful but carrying the young determination of someone standing in the light for the first time. The sound of pens signing documents echoed at the back of the room like a milestone, marking the moment when long-buried stories were finally entering a real investigative process. Chief Williams watched it all, his expression deep, as though recognizing that this case would open far more than anyone expected. It was not just a meeting, but the beginning of a path for the entire community to re-examine how power was being used and how people responded when that power was abused. The meeting room was no longer quiet. The space was now filled with the soft breaths of people who had just set down their burdens. The sound of documents being passed from hand to hand and the low but steady voices of residents discussing their next steps. Malik looked at Raven, and then at the people standing around them. He said nothing, but Raven understood that look. It was gratitude. That unity made Malik feel that he had not been born to endure injustice, that sometimes people only needed one person to step forward so they could follow and break the silence. In that moment, the small community here learned to reconnect as a unified whole, not to fight a single individual, but to protect what was right and the standards they wanted their town to represent. And at the center of that shift were ordinary people, people who had once been forgotten, once afraid, now standing up to speak about what they had endured. Raven stood still for a second, inhaled deeply, her eyes turning to Malik. The siblings did not speak aloud, but both understood that from this moment on nothing would be the same. And as the doors of the meeting room slowly opened, letting in the light from outside shining across each tired but resolute face, everyone knew their fight had entered a new chapter 1, where none of them stood alone anymore. If you want, I can expand this section into an emotional impact analysis or a short video script. What would you like next? That morning, the police station hallway was more crowded than usual, not because of a major case, but because of the first public hearing held to review the misconduct of an officer once considered strict but dedicated. People gathered not for spectacle, but because they shared one desire: the truth needed to be put back where it belonged. Inside the hearing room, chairs were arranged in long rows. Soft, white lights, pale wooden tables, and smooth walls created a formal atmosphere. But what weighed on the room more than anything was the look in the eyes of those who had waited far too long for answers. Malik took a seat in the front row with Raven standing behind him like a silent anchor. Her presence added a particular kind of energy to the room, and that people sensed the moment she arrived: steadiness and transparency. The back door opened again, this time revealing the victims who had endured mistreatment under Hughes. They did not come as a group yet. Their eyes were strikingly similar. Eyes that had endured, that had feared, and that had finally found an opportunity to speak about what they had long believed was pointless to voice. A woman supporting her elderly father, a young man walking with a friend for courage, a boy standing close to his mother so he would not shake. No one needed to speak, but everyone understood that today was the day they would no longer turn away from the truth. Chief Williams sat at the center of the hearing table with a stack of color-marked documents in front of him from the night before. Internal Affairs investigators lined both sides, ready to record every detail. When the small gavel struck the table, the room fell utterly silent. Williams opened the first file, his eyes moving across each page as if confirming once more what he was about to read. Today's hearing is held to review violations in the conduct of Officer Kellen Hughes, he said, articulating each word. In addition to the incident involving Malik Carter, we have received multiple similar complaints from prior cases. His public acknowledgement of the earlier complaints sent a small ripple through the room. A few residents nodded firmly as if they had waited too long for that sentence. The first document presented was the report from Malik's case. Williams read each line in an even, emotionless tone, letting the facts reveal their own weight. The suspect forced the victim into the vehicle he read, then lifted his head to look at the room. According to the official statement from Mr. Doyle, the victim entered willingly and requested a ride home due to dizziness from medication. Below, people murmured. Doyle sat near the back of the room, his face slightly pale, but his eyes resolute, as if to say he would no longer let anyone rewrite the story of his own life. Williams continued. Witness statements from the scene indicate there were no signs of resistance, no hostile language from Malik. He paused so the investigators could record it. From the left side of the room, a woman stood. She asked to speak. "I am the one who saw him help the old man," she said. "I also heard Mr. Doyle thank him. There was no coercion at all." Her words made Malik turn toward her, his eyes softening with emotion. Raven placed a hand on his shoulder in quiet support. The next portion, brought the entire room to silence. Williams moved on to older reports, the ones previously labeled confusing but not misconduct. One document detailed how Hughes accused a young man of theft simply because he was black and had been standing outside a store for a few minutes. Another described Hughes threatening to arrest a young woman because she helped her elderly neighbor after a fall. A third involved a teenager whose bicycle was confiscated for suspicious observation, though he had merely been waiting for his friend after school. The reports were opened page by page, line by line, for the entire room to see. What lay inside made it easy for everyone to recognize a common pattern. Williams summarized reports written on personal assumptions, dismissal of actual statements, incomplete investigations, along with biased interpretations based on race and personal circumstances. He allowed the rising murmur of the room to spread like a natural response. Malik leaned forward, not in surprise, but because he felt every word restoring the voice he had previously been denied. When Williams asked Hughes to stand and explain, the whole room turned toward him. Hughes rose with a heavy posture, his lips pressed so tightly they had turned pale. "I followed procedure," he said, his voice so faint that a few people had to lean in to hear. Williams asked plainly, "If it was procedure, why do all the details in your reports contradict the actual statements from the community?" Hughes faltered, his eyes darting around the room searching for something to cling to that was not there. His silence became a louder answer than any defense he could offer. The review board continued questioning, this time about procedures for assessing a victim. Hughes could not explain why Mr. Doyle, an elderly man showing signs of medication-induced dizziness, was not medically evaluated and instead pressured into answering questions while disoriented. He could not explain why all of his reports followed the same pattern of assumption. He could not explain why none of the files included original statements from civilians, only his one-sided conclusions. The room sank into a tension tight as a drawn string. At last, when every question had gone unanswered, Williams closed the file. The sound of the folder snapping shut was so sharp it made the entire room tremble. The actions of Officer Kellen Hughes go far beyond ordinary misconduct, he said. This is no longer a professional error. This is abuse of power. The people in the room held their breath. An elderly man lifted a hand to his chest as if releasing something heavy. A young woman tightened her hold on her son's hand as though reminding him that the truth had finally been acknowledged. Raven looked at Hughes for a moment, her gaze not hateful but cold with the resolve of someone who refuses to let wrongdoing repeat itself. Williams delivered the final sentence, the one that closed the most crucial part of the hearing. The council's conclusion is severe abuse of power. The case will proceed to the next stage of action. No one applauded, but the room brightened in another way. It was the light of truth being unfastened, the light of trust being returned after a long period of concealment. Malik sat still for a few seconds, then released a breath as though at last he could inhale with his whole lungs again. And from that moment on, everyone understood that justice had truly begun to move. Slow but steady, firm and without turning back. The large meeting room of the police department fell silent, as if all the air had been pulled out when the investigative council returned after nearly 1 hour of deliberation. The residents who had stepped forward to accuse Hughes sat close together in the row on the right, their eyes fixed on the hearing stand with attention mixed with hope. Malik sat in the front, Raven standing behind him, her posture straight like a protective marker. The white light from the ceiling fixtures washed over the long table, making the entire room feel solemn in a way no one dared disturb with even an unnecessary sound. No one spoke when Chief Williams rose. He placed both hands on the edge of the table, leaned slightly toward the microphone, his expression taut under the weight of the moment. Opposite him, Hughes sat frozen like a statue, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles turned pale. He tried to keep his eyes on the tabletop, but he could not hide the fear crawling fast beneath his skin, making his shoulders tremble with every quick breath. Williams scanned the room to be sure everyone was settled before opening the file in front of him. Based on the results of the public hearing, based on the testimonies of witnesses, the findings of internal affairs, and the comparison between prior reports and the verified truth, he paused for a beat, his voice low and clear. The council has reached its final decision regarding Officer Kellen Hughes. The faint rustle of paper sounded as he turned to the next page. Then, in the breathless stillness of the room, he read each word. Officer Kellen Hughes is suspended from duty, effective immediately. A long exhale broke from the back row, followed by several others rising like a chorus of long-buried relief. Mr. Doyle, seated among them, lifted a trembling hand as he closed his eyes. Malik bowed his head, feeling as though a heavy cloth that had smothered his chest for days had finally been lifted. Raven placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and grounding. But the hearing was not finished. Williams raised another document so everyone could see it. In addition to suspension, the council formally strips Officer Hughes of his badge. His voice was firm without hesitation. This action will be carried out here in this room. An internal affairs officer stepped toward Hughes and halted in front of him. Hughes lifted his head, eyes reddened, leaning back slightly in instinctive defense. I object. He choked you. Do not understand. His protest was cut short as the officer reached toward the left breast of his uniform. With one decisive motion, the bright metal badge was removed, leaving an empty patch of fabric beneath. The sound of metal landing in the officer's palm was dry and cold, like a blow severing the authority that had shielded Hughes for so many years. The room stayed utterly silent as the moment unfolded. Hughes stared at the badge that had just been removed from his chest, as if watching all his authority, his armor, and his arrogance fall away at once. He opened his mouth to say something more, but produced only a fractured breath. His eyes drifted around the room, meeting the gazes of people he had hurt. No one feared him anymore. The looks they gave him held no anger, only release. Williams continued reading, his voice firm as though nailing each word into the air. Given the severity of the violations, Hughes's case will be forwarded to the county prosecutor's office for consideration of criminal charges. A small ripple of murmurs swept through the room. A woman who had once reported Hughes covered her mouth, overwhelmed. The young man with the scar near his eyebrow gave a slow nod, his eyes bright with the justice he never thought he would live to witness. Malik looked toward the table where the investigators were signing the final transfer documents, feeling a shift inside him as if he were standing at the turning point of a life pushed to the edge of despair only days earlier. Williams did not stop. He set the document on the table, his voice deeper than usual as he declared, "The prosecutor will review charges including fabrication of statements, abuse of authority, violation of the civil rights of an innocent citizen, and obstruction of justice." The list fell into the room like heavy stones striking the darkest parts of Hughes's record. The truth he had fought to deny had nowhere left to hide. An officer near the exit opened the door, preparing to escort Hughes out for suspension, processing, and temporary seizure of his credentials. Hughes rose slowly, arms hanging loose, shoulders slumped like a man who had lost every anchor. He turned toward Malik, his gaze stripped of arrogance, filled instead with panic and something close to collapse. Malik did not look away. He simply stood straight and silent without hatred or bitterness. That steady look made Hughes drop his eyes and follow the internal affairs officer like a shadow that no longer knew its path. When Hughes left the room, a wave of audible relief rose from several corners. It was not cheering, but the long exhale of people who had endured drawn-out injustice under his hand. They did not need to see him hauled off to jail that instant. Knowing he would face the law was enough to feel that justice had begun to move. Raven looked at Malik from beside him, her eyes softening after hours of being sharp as a blade. "Everything has gone exactly where it needed to go," she said quietly, her voice falling over him like a breath of comfort. Malik nodded slightly, feeling his chest expand with each new, easier breath. In the back row, Mr. Doyle slowly brought his hands together in applause. A few others followed, and then the entire hearing room joined in. It was not loud, not celebratory, but full of gratitude for justice taking its rightful place. Malik stood still, listening to the applause like warm water passing over wounds on his shoulders and neck that had not yet healed. Williams waited for the applause to settle before giving his final words. "The community has spoken," he said, "and today justice has taken another step forward. That only happened because people chose to stand up." The hearing room doors opened light from the hallway pouring in, carrying the feeling of something ending and something beginning. Malik drew a deep breath into his chest, looked at Raven, then down at the hands that had once been cuffed and squeezed until they burned. Now those hands were free. Not only because the cuffs had been removed, but because the truth had pulled him out of the darkness. The entire room seemed to breathe in the same rhythm, the rhythm of people who knew that from this day on their town had crossed an important line. From this day on, a police officer who once believed he stood above justice would have to face the law the same way anyone else must. And from this day on, those who had been pushed into the weaker position could trust that their voices mattered. Malik walked out of the hearing room beside Raven, his eyes fixed on the end of the hallway as the doors slowly closed behind the two of them. On his face, the marks of old pain had faded, replaced by the calm and certainty of someone who had finally reclaimed his dignity. The community stayed behind them, no one speaking, but everyone knowing they had just witnessed something important. Justice does not arrive quickly, but when it comes, it touches everyone. A few mornings after the prosecution hearing, soft sunlight fell across the small street where everything had begun breaking into patches along the pavement as the wind stirred the tree canopy above. Malik pulled over at the curb right where he had braked hard to catch Doyle's trembling body that day. There were no police sirens now, no harsh shouting tearing through the afternoon, no fearful looks from neighbors at the sight of a black man in cuffs. The space was peaceful in a way that made it hard to believe it had once been the center of a misconduct case that shook the entire district. Malik stood still for several seconds, eyes lowered to the pavement as if trying to commit everything to memory, as though he, too, needed to return to that moment to breathe fully again. Raven stepped out from the driver's side, closing the door gently. She stood behind Malik for a few seconds without saying a word, letting the silence stretch to the length it deserved. Malik kept staring at the empty space in front of him, his eyes no longer tense, but still carrying the somber weight of someone who had lived through something capable of altering a lifetime. "I remember every second," he said, slowly, voice low, the smell of his medicine, the way he grabbed my sleeve the moment Hughes came at us. Raven didn't answer at once. She only placed a hand on her brother's back, light as breath. "Things like that," she said, "aren't meant to be forgotten. They're meant to remind us we were standing in the right place." From the end of the street, the sound of a gate opening echoed. Doyle stepped out slowly, leaning on a walnut cane worn smooth after years of use. He wore a thin ash-gray sweater, and though he looked a bit older after the exhausting days behind him, his face held the clarity of someone who had finally reclaimed a sense of peace. When he saw Malik, a soft smile appeared, tired but kind, carrying a steady gratitude. Malik walked toward him, each step matching the rhythm of the cane tapping the ground. When they stood face to face, Doyle placed a hand on Malik's arm, his palm trembling but warm. "Son," he said, his voice drawn out as if weighing each word to capture every piece of feeling. Malik bowed his head to greet him, the lines at his eyes easing when he saw how much stronger the old man looked than the last time they met. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, his tone filled with a gentleness those who knew Malik would recognize as rare. Doyle nodded and eased down onto a small wooden chair his granddaughter had placed near the door. He gestured for Malik to sit beside him, then looked toward Raven standing nearby. "You both give me peace," he said, his voice soft but edged with pride. Raven smiled and leaned against the tree trunk, giving the two men space. The street was quiet except for the rustling leaves and the steady tap of Doyle's cane. Malik waited, sensing the old man had more to say, something heavier than gratitude and deeper than a simple greeting. And Doyle, breathing slowly, finally looked into Malik's eyes, ready to speak the words he had carried ever since that day. The air along the small street seemed to slow, the sound of wind touching the leaves audible with every beat. A few neighbors stood on their doorsteps or at their windows, not wanting to intrude, but also not wanting to miss this moment. Everyone could feel something important was about to be said. Malik watched Doyle, his gaze softening as the old man placed a lightly trembling hand over his squeezing, once slow and steady. That day, Doyle began. I thought that fall would put me down for good. He paused, exhaled, and looked down at the old shoes that had carried him for years. But you were right there, as if you were sent at that exact moment to keep me off the ground. Malik opened his mouth to say he'd only done what any decent person would, but Doyle lifted a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," he said. He drew a breath, his voice steadier and louder than before. "That day, you saved me." Malik looked into his eyes, saw how age-clouded pupils now glistened with profound gratitude. Then Doyle leaned forward a little, his thin but firm hand resting on Malik's knee, and he spoke so slowly that each word felt like it dropped onto the pavement. And today he lifted his head, his eyes bright, as if younger by decades. "You saved this whole town from a lie." No one on the street moved, no one blinked. The words rang out and hung there heavy enough to awaken the memories of everyone who had watched Hughes run unchecked, and light enough to feel like a breath from those who had believed justice would never come. Malik froze his body, trembling slightly, as if the sentence had struck his chest harder than anything else he had endured. He bowed his head, eyelashes fluttering, then looked up at Doyle, unable to speak for several seconds. Raven stepped forward from the tree, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder, like an anchor holding him steady in the swell of emotion rising inside him. "You did the right thing from the start," she said, her voice not loud but strong enough to steady his breathing. Malik looked at his sister, his eyes deeper than usual with the calm that comes after storms. "I told you Raven went on kindness doesn't make you weak, but sometimes to keep it you have to stand up the way you did that day." Her words made Malik breathe harder, as if releasing the heaviest part of what he had been carrying. Malik looked down at the spot where he stood, the very place he had caught Doyle, the very place Hughes had slammed him onto the hood, the very place where everything had nearly pushed him over the edge of his life. The now peaceful street felt like a silent witness to both the wrong that had passed and the good being rebuilt. "Kindness is enough," Malik said, his eyes on the sunlight spilling across the pavement, his voice steady and low, as if speaking to the whole street, to the people behind the windows, listening, and to himself. "But sometimes you have to fight to protect it." The wind moved the tree canopy leaves, spinning as they fell, creating a sound so soft it was almost inaudible. Raven stood beside Malik, tilting her head slightly, as if recognizing that something in him had changed. Not because the incident made him stronger, but because he had finally understood the value of what he had done. A few neighbors nodded gently, some closed their eyes to hold on to the moment. Doyle remained seated, his gentle smile visible, his hand trembling but steady as he rested it on Malik's knee one last time and whispered, "This town needs people like you." A car passed at the end of the street, but its sound did not break the moment. It moved by like part of the backdrop, while the center of everything remained the three people standing under the soft gold sunlight, connected by an afternoon that should have been full of injustice, but instead became a moment that changed an entire community. Malik rose, looked to Raven, then bowed his head in thanks to Doyle. In that light, the story ended, not with sirens, not with shouting, but with the quiet that had been returned to the place it belonged. A quiet that carried the reminder that kindness is a choice, but protecting kindness is a responsibility. And sometimes one person standing up is enough to save an entire town from a lie. When the hearing ended and the hallway slowly emptied, Malik's story spread through the town as an important reminder of kindness and the power of courage. In the days that followed, many residents retold the moment they saw an ordinary man step in to help a disabled elder in the street, only to be dragged into a spiral of abuse that anyone vulnerable could face. Malik had said he acted only because his heart urged him to, and that simple choice carried him through a harsh trial where truth was suffocated by bias and power held by an officer who no longer honored his oath. Yet, in the end, that act of kindness became the key that helped the entire community see the cracks long hidden beneath the town's calm surface. Doyle became another symbol of the incident, not as a victim, but through the weight of his words as an elder. After recovering better, he would remind people that sometimes they must slow down to see who is truly helping them. What he said to Malik under the soft sunlight made many fall into thoughtful silence. Years of living alone with age and frailty taught him that kindness always has value, even when the world grows more complicated, even when that kindness is misunderstood. When he said Malik had saved the whole town from a lie, many understood it was not praise, but a reminder of the shared responsibility a community holds when it witnesses wrongdoing. Raven also left in people's minds the image of a soldier who never separated herself from her humanity. She arrived at the scene not with rank to overpower anyone, but with the instinct to protect her family and the sharpness of someone who had seen the fragile line between right and wrong. It was her calm but unyielding demeanor that turned everything around, not through shouting, but through the steady assertion that justice is not something one individual can bend at will. The image of Raven standing in front of Malik, her hand resting on her holster like a warning that her intervention was meant to end abuse, not provoke conflict, became the spark that pushed the community to stand with the truth. The story also revealed another perspective on the fear that once silenced witnesses. Many admitted they had seen Hughes behave similarly before, but never found the courage to speak up. It was not cowardice, but the feeling of being trapped under a system they believed would swallow their voices whole. When they saw someone willing to confront wrongdoing, they realized truth needs many voices to take shape. Through that unity, the altered reports were exposed and the buried stories were finally brought to light. Hughes paid a price he never imagined he would lose, not because someone framed him, but because his own actions were reflected back by the community. His downfall did not come from a single decision, but from years of accumulated misconduct. The moment his badge was removed in front of the public felt like a symbol that justice, even delayed, still carries the power to reclaim what has been misused. And when the case files were sent to prosecutors, many understood the process was not ending there. Justice needs time, but what mattered was that it had begun. From this incident, the town learned more than it expected. They realized kindness is not just a word, but an action capable of changing someone's life, sometimes in ways no one can predict. They learned they cannot judge people by skin color or by rushed assumptions about their intentions. Kindness does not choose its recipients, and courage does not wait for convenient timing to show itself. The residents also understood that every injustice requires many people to stand up together. One voice can be ignored, but 10 voices, 20 voices, or an entire community create a weight no one can dismiss. In the end, the town could see clearly that the strength of a community is not measured by the absence of wrongdoing, but by how many people choose not to look away when it happens. Malik, after everything, did not become a hero in the traditional sense. He remained the man who simply wanted to help an old man sit safely in a car seat. But it was exactly his ordinariness that made the story feel closer and more inspiring. He did not change who he was after the the ordeal. He only understood more clearly that kindness sometimes requires firmness, and that one right action can force someone to fight far more than he ever expected. Raven's pride in Malik did not come from the fact that he was cleared, but from the fact that he kept living the way he always had, even when facing violence. In the end, the story delivers the message that justice is not built on status or authority, but on truth and the persistence of those who dare to stand up. It reminds us that a right action sometimes begins unintentionally, but can end in profound change. It reminds us that in the midst of injustice, kindness is still something that can save others and save ourselves. And above all, Malik's story shows that every person can become a point of light in the dark, as long as they do not turn away from what they believe is right. If that spirit can be kept alive, not just one small town, but any community can become stronger and kinder little by little.